Hello everyone, I'm Colin Fogarty and this is your World History 1 SOL review. So we're going to begin our world history journey in Africa, specifically here in the Horn of Africa, where hominid, also known as Homo sapiens, or human or man, is going to appear. But they're not going to stick around in the Horn of Africa for very long because they are nomadic, which means they're going to basically go anywhere that they can find food. So they're going to stay in caves at night, and they're going to draw animal artwork in those caves, which historians believe meant that they believed in animalism, or the power of animal spirits. So as they're nomadic and as they're looking for food, they're going to spread across the world, everywhere from Europe to the Arabian Peninsula, to Asia, to the Indian subcontinent, to Oceania over here with all the islands, to the Americas. And this is all because they're able to develop fire, they're able to control fire. And during this time, people live in close-knit nomadic tribes, and they have developed oral languages. And all this time period is called the Paleolithic Era. But we're not going to spend that much time in the Paleolithic Era because humans are finally going to be able to learn how to farm, and the agricultural revolution is spawned. So humans are going to start settling down in large settlements, like one named Katal Hayuk, and because we have so much food, we're going to start seeing specialization of labor. So we're going to see pottery, we're going to see weaving, we're going to see metalworking, and other special kinds of crafts. Now, most of these settlements are going to take place in the Fertile Crescent. We can even see trade between these Neolithic settlements, and this is all part of the Neolithic era. But wait, humans have finally found these things called river valleys, and they're going to think they're cool. So they're going to start settling down in them, and this is where we're going to see our first civilizations. So we have one here on the Nile, we have one here between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, we're going to have one here in the Indus River Valley, and we're going to have one up here in the Huang He River Valley. And all of these different civilizations in these river valleys are going to give way into modern countries like Egypt, Iraq, India, and China. But for now, we're going to turn our eyes to the Mediterranean, where civilizations are going to start popping up. And one of them are called Hebrews, and they're led by a guy named Abraham, who forms a covenant with God. And this leads to the creation of Judaism, which is one of the first monotheistic religions in the world. But the Hebrews are soon captured by the Egyptians and made slaves until some guy named Moses parts the Red Sea, receives the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai, and leads the Hebrews to the Promised Land, where they defeat the Kenites. But soon they're going to be captured by the Babylonians, but freed again, which leads to the Jewish diaspora. Now, during this time, Jews are going to gain a distinct identity. They're going to develop what we call the Torah, or the Old Testament of the Christian Bible, and they're going to begin developing many of their traditions. But elsewhere in the Middle East, the Phoenicians are starting to form, and the Phoenicians are going to be here in what we call the Levant, or modern-day Lebanon. And they're going to build boats from lumber to facilitate their economy because there's very low land that they can develop agriculture on. So they're going to colonize vast amounts of the Mediterranean. They're going to have colonies here in North Africa. One of them is going to become Carthage, and it's going to fight Rome later on. We're going to see colonies here in the Iberian Peninsula. We're going to see colonies up here in Asia Minor. We're going to see colonies here in Sicily, in Corsica. And they're going to eventually develop a writing language based off of sound called phonetics. And this is where we get pretty much all of our modern oral languages from. But wait, the Middle East also has another great civilization called Persia, rising under Cyrus the Great. And he's going to conquer huge amounts of land from Persia to the Fertile Crescent, to Egypt, to Asia Minor here, and eventually he's going to decide to build his capital in Persepolis, which is going to be right around here. Now, the Persians are going to host one of the largest armies and empires of the ancient world. So how do they maintain this empire? Well, they're going to build this huge bureaucracy to manage the huge amount of land, and they're going to build roads and rest stops with troops, and so that troops could be moved and mail could be moved, and this is going to allow easy movement. And this road that they're going to build from here in Asia Minor to Persepolis is going to be called the Royal Road. Now, the Persians also are able to maintain their great empire by showing tolerance towards different groups. Guess who freed the Jews from the Babylonian captivity? Well, it was Cyrus the Great. In Persia, we also see the development of Zoroastrianism, which is a sort of monotheistic religion, but it's focused on dual doing, as in two parts dueling elements of the world. But soon the Persians are going to try to invade another land called Greece, right here. Now both Darius II and Xerxes, both Persian rulers, are going to try to take over Greece, but they will fail. Darius is going to lose at the Battle of Marathon, and Xerxes is going to lose at the Battle of Salamis and Plataea after being held up at the Battle of Thermopylae by the Spartans. But hey, who are these Greeks anyway? Well, the Greeks were a large group of people who lived in city-states in the territory known as Greece. Now, Greece had very little land that they could actually use to farm, so they decided to do what the Phoenicians did, and they colonized lands. The Greeks had colonies from Sicily to modern-day France, up in the Black Sea, and these would all create special relationships between the polis, or city-state, that colonized the territory, which would be soon called metropolis. Now, the classical Greek culture was dominated by two powers. Sparta, which is going to be on the Peloponnese Peninsula, which I don't know if you can see it, but I'm trying to point to it right here, and you're going to see Athens on the Attica Peninsula. Now, Sparta was a military society that was dominated by an oligarchy and had the strongest land army in Greece, while Athens was a direct democracy for males only that featured the strongest navy. Now, after beating the Persians for the second time, Athens will enter their golden age under a guy named Pericles, where democracy reached its height and they were able to build structures like the Parthenon and the statue of Athena. Now, all the while, Athens is going to rule over an alliance called the Delian League, which was basically an alliance between multiple city-states, and it had a treasury located in Delos, but Athens is actually going to move that treasury to, well, their home city of Athens, to assert more power and dominance in the area. Now, in response to the power grabbing of Athens, Sparta is going to form the Peloponnesian League, but soon these two alliances are actually going to go into conflict with each other during the Peloponnesian War, which, spoiler alert, Athens loses, but in the end, all of Greece kind of loses because due to the Peloponnesian Wars, they're so weakened that the Macedonians, with their great phalanxes, are able to come in and basically dominate all of Greece. But hey, who are the Macedonians? Well, the Macedonians live in northern territory of Greece, up right around there, and they're going to be led by Philip of Macedon when they take over Greece. But Philip of Macedon is going to die, and he's going to be succeeded by Alexander the Great, who, with his great Macedonian phalanx and companion cavalry, is going to be able to conquer all of the Persian Empire, and even territory into India, which leads to the Hellenistic era. Now, this would be a good time to review the important people of Greece. So, here we go. Aristotle, Socrates, and Plato were philosophers. Phidias and Myron were sculptors and artists. Euclid and Pythagoras gave huge advancements to geometry and math. Hippocrates made contributions to medicine. Sophocles, Aristophanes, Aeschylus, and Euripides were all people involved in Greek theater. Herodotus and Thucydides were both historians. Okay, I would love to spend more time talking about the Greek and Hellenistic culture, but we have to move on to Rome. Rome, the greatest empire of the world. Now, Rome starts in the city-state of Rome on the Italian peninsula, but they're soon going to grow, and they don't want to have a monarch anymore, so they decide that a republic is better, so they overthrow the king and instate a republic, which Cincinnatus has to save. But soon, the plebeians, or the not-rich people, get mad at the patricians, or the rich people, in what is going to be called the conflict of the orders, which leads to reform in the Roman Republic. But what was the Roman Republic? Well, it was a government composed of a senate and assembly. So a senate of patricians, which from those patricians, 2 consuls were elected, and we could think of consuls as modern-day presidents. And they also had a plebeian assembly, which elected about 4 to 7 tribunes, and they had total veto power. Now, 2 famous tribunes that served at different times were the Gracchi brothers, who wanted to reform the Roman Republic and died trying. Then this guy, Marius, comes along, and he creates the Marian Reforms, which opens up military service to basically anybody, creating a new class called equestrians, who were between plebs and patricians. But Marius gets into a civil war with this guy named Sulla, and Sulla wins, leading to a dictatorship under Sulla, but Rome doesn't really like that, so they overthrow Sulla. So then a couple of decades later, this guy, Julius Caesar, comes along and says he wants to be powerful, and forms a triumvirate with himself, Crassus, who's the richest man in Rome at the time, and Pompey, the most popular general in Rome at the time. Now, eventually, Caesar becomes the governor of Lower Gallic territories over here, and he decides he wants to conquer all of Gaul. So he does. So he conquers all of Gaul, which is modern-day France. But eventually, the Senate and Pompey are mad at Caesar, and they want to try him for Caesar's multitude of political crimes, so they want to bring him back. But Caesar doesn't want to go get tried for crimes, so he crosses the Rubicon River with his 13th Legion and effectively declares war on Rome. So, spoiler alert, in a civil war, Caesar beats Pompey and becomes dictator life, but not for long because eventually he gets stabbed in the back quite literally. So in response to Caesar's assassination, Mark Antony, Lepidus, and Octavian form the second triumvirate to oppose Caesar's assassins, and they win another civil war. And, well, Octavian and Antony, both being Caesar's most beloved people, are trying to figure out who's going to become, or who's going to inherit all of Caesar's possessions. And spoiler alert, it's Octavian. So Mark Antony and Octavian have another civil war, which Mark Antony loses. Yeesh, that's a lot of civil wars. And hey, Cleopatra was in that last one between Mark Antony. So Mark Antony loses at the Battle of Actium, and Octavian names himself Augustus Caesar and Emperor of Rome, and Rome enters the Pax Romanum, or Roman peace. Now, during this time, Rome's going to build structures like the Colosseum, the Pantheon, in the Baths of Hadrian.
Okay, so two quick corrections here. First of all, it's not the Baths of Hadrian, it's the Baths of Caracalla. And second of all, the Colosseum, the Baths of Caracalla, and the Pantheon won't necessarily be built during the time period in which we would consider the Pax Romanum to be, but they will be constructed during the height of Rome's power, the height of Rome's glory, and that's really what the message I'm trying to convey here. Not necessarily that they were built within the time period that was the Pax Romanum.
Rome's going to expand its borders to its absolute height. They're going to have territory all the way from Egypt to the Fertile Crescent, to Dacia, to England, to the Iberian Peninsula and northern Africa. But trouble is going to be on the horizon very soon. Even though they're going to have all this economic success during the Pax Romanum, Rome's economy is going to start to decline, and its empire is going to be weakened by more and more bad emperors and barbarians on their Germanic borders. So despite reforms by Domitian, especially economic reforms, the empire just continuously devolves and declines until it's split into two halves, the East and the West. Now, eventually, a guy named Constantine will win another civil war and create a city in the eastern half of Rome named Constantinople. Now, all the while, this new religion is popping up as followers of a guy named Jesus, who was crucified, start preaching. And this religion is going to become Christianity. Now, while Christianity spreads kind of slowly at first, it spreads across the Roman Empire eventually until Constantine legalizes it and his son becomes an official Christian. However, Western Rome is under constant attack, and the Roman military's constant reliance on foreign mercenaries, or paid armies of non-Romans, made it impossible to defend until a guy named Attila the Hun overruns Western Rome. But Eastern Rome is going to be able to survive until it becomes the Byzantine Empire. Now, the Byzantines are going to have this great emperor named Justinian, who's going to build the Hagia Sophia, a famous church, and creates Justinian's Code, which compiles all of the laws from the old Roman Republic and Roman Empire into one source. However, Justinian's also going to try to conquer old territory of Rome and adopt Greek as its official language. Now, two guys from the Byzantines named Cyril and Methodius are going to go to the Slavs right around here, and they're going to convert them to Christianity by creating their own alphabet for the Slavs called Cyrillic. Now, the Byzantines are going to practice a distinct sect of Christianity that will soon become Orthodox Christianity. However, Christians, between the Eastern Christians and Western Christians, are going to split upon two distinct lines. Now, the Western Church and Eastern Church. The Western Church had their Mass in Latin and invested their power in the Pope. However, the Eastern Church had their Masses in Greek and invested their power into the Patriarch of Constantinople. Now, things are going to get so out of hand, like the iconoclast controversy, which was led by the Eastern Church and demanded the destruction of religious icons, and this is going to eventually lead to the East-West schism in the creation of the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox churches. Hey, but what's going on in the Middle East? Because we haven't been there in a while. Well, in the city of Mecca, this guy named Muhammad has left the city to visit a cave, and he gets a message from Allah and begins to spread the word of Allah until he's kicked out of Mecca, and he travels to Medina, where he gains a massive following and conquers Mecca and declares the Kaaba a shrine to Allah, starting what we know today as Islam. Now, Islam has 5 pillars: Shahada, or the oath to Allah; Salat, or prayer, which is supposed to be 5 times a day; Zakat, or giving to the poor; Ramadan, which is a month-long observance in which Muslims abstain from sex, food, and drink until sundown; and Hajj, or a pilgrimage to Mecca to pay your respects to Allah. Now, each Muslim is supposed to practice these 5 pillars. Now, eventually, Islam is going to spread rapidly, but not before major controversy between 2 groups, Sunnis and Shias. Now, Sunnis believe that the most capable person in a Muslim community should lead, but Shias believe that only people who are descendants of Muhammad should lead. And spoiler alert, the Sunnis become more popular because Shias are only about 15% of Muslims today. But the rise of Islam gives way to the Umayyad Caliphate, based out of Damascus, which is all the way from here in Spain or the Iberian Peninsula to Persia. Now, this eventually leads to the Abbasid dynasty, based out of Baghdad. And the Abbasid dynasty is when Islam's going to experience its golden age. And from the golden age of Islam, we get things like algebra, scientific and medical advances from the Baghdad House of Wisdom, new types of art such as Arabic calligraphy and mosaics, great pieces of literature like the Rubaiyat and 1001 Nights. However, Baghdad's going to be sacked by Mongol hordes, and it's going to bring down the massive power of the Abbasids until Muslim dynasties start to fracture into different smaller kingdoms. But what's happening in Western Europe? Well, they're in a dark age with very low literacy rates and very low economic activity. Then the Franks rose to power. They stopped the Muslim invaders at the Battle of Tours in modern-day France under a guy, and then eventually under a guy named Charlemagne, they're going to basically unite pretty much all the territory in Germany and France. Now, eventually, Charlemagne's going to be crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 800 AD by the Pope, and even though he tries to help advance Western Europe by increasing literacy rates and trying to help with libraries and everything, he's going to die. And eventually, once his kingdom reaches its grandkids, it's going to be split into 3 parts by the Treaty of Verdun. But the middle part, ruled by a guy named Lothar, is going to be gobbled up by the other 2 parts. Francia in the west and Germania in the east. But the Vikings arrive, and they basically destroy everything that the Franks built, and as a response, feudalism is developed. Now, where did these Vikings come from? Well, the Vikings came from here in Scandinavia, and they had these really cool boats that can basically go anywhere that there's water. So anywhere that there's water, which is where cities were going to be built in medieval times, they were able to sack them, and eventually feudalism is created as a response to these Viking invaders. So feudalism, well, what was feudalism? Feudalism was a political system that focused on a king granting land to a vassal, and then vassals granting that land to sub-vassals and knights, which would then be guaranteed farming rights to peasants. Now, during an investiture, a king would grant a fief, or a piece of land, to a vassal in return for an oath of loyalty and service. The king could settle disputes between vassals and assist in protection and perhaps food if needed. But other than that, vassals were pretty much the rulers of their fiefs, not the king. Now, feudalism relied on a manorial system for the economy, in which large manors were the centers of huge farming estates with little trade and little economic interaction. In fact, peasants weren't allowed to really leave their vassal's territory unless they wanted to be basically disowned by their vassal. But what else is happening around now? Well, the Pope, specifically Pope Urban II, is calling on all Christians to unite and take back the Holy Land because Deus Vult. Well, actually, the Pope just wanted more power, the nobles wanted more money, the knights wanted more glory, and the peasants wanted more Jesus points. So they eventually go to the Holy Land and take back Jerusalem from the Muslim people that had taken over Jerusalem and establish a group of crusader states out of the territories that they conquer. However, this first crusade is the only crusade that's going to be successful, even though there would be about 8 more crusades after it. However, the crusades are going to spark a lot of trade in Europe, and it's going to strengthen kings and weaken feudalism, empower the church, and lead lasting divisions between Muslims and Christians. Now, while this is all nice and dandy, the Black Death is going to arrive in the 1300s and almost kill all of Europe. Regions like Italy and France experienced the worst of it, with about 15% of their populations being killed. And the Black Death is going to basically shut down Europe. But once it passed, it gave rise to trade again and peasant rights, as labor shortages increased the need for peasants to do work and gave them more bargaining power at the table. Oh, and the Jews got blamed for it. Sorry, Jews. Also, England is a thing. Basically, the story goes like this. Angles, Saxons, Danelaw, William the Conqueror conquers and wins at the Battle of Hastings. Then Henry II creates common law and trial by jury, shaping modern-day criminal law. But then Henry II also gets in trouble with the church, which is no bueno. But later, John I comes along and the nobles get mad at him, so they force him to sign the Magna Carta, which limits the power of the kings and grants rights to Englishmen. Also, there's a war between England and France called the Hundred Years' War, but it's not really 100 years. And England is winning at first, but France makes a late round comeback, led by Joan of Arc, and eventually defeats the English to become become fully unified and the strongest monarchy in Europe. And this is in the Hundred Years' War, it's also going to lead to distinct divisions in the culture between England and France. So now we head into the Renaissance, which is where our European story ends, where the Italians are starting to commission art to honor themselves, but also involves religious scenes and mythological stories from Greece and Rome. Romanesque and Gothic architecture are on the rise. Humanism is born as a school of thought that focuses on the individual person and celebrated the classical works by Greeks and Romans. Machiavelli writes the first modern political treatise called The Prince, in which he advocates for absolute monarchy and power. But the Renaissance also moves north, where humanism is transformed into Christian humanism, and writers use the Gutenberg movable type printing press to spread new ideas. Erasmus critiques the church in his book In Praise of Folly, and Sir Thomas More advocates for socialism, in his book Utopia. But now let's move east and south, and even to the Americas as we scramble to review here. So India starts off in the Indus River Valley with two big cities, Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. But all of a sudden they're gone, and this new group of people called Indo-Aryans arrive, and they start using their hymns and mantras to create this thing called the Vedas, which is going to serve as the basis for Hinduism, the religion in the area. A polytheistic religion that believes in rebirth, karma, and something known as the caste system, which assigns people a certain class that they must strictly live in and cannot go anywhere outside of that caste. They also really like the Ganges River for some reason. It's a holy site. So India develops over time into the Mahayana Empire, and then this guy named Asoka decides that Hinduism isn't for him, converts to Buddhism, and then sends Buddhist missionaries across Southeast Asia to spread the Buddhist message. So eventually the Mahayana Empire is going to collapse, and it's going to lead to the Gupta Empire, which is going to be the golden age of India, where there are advances in education, art, literature, science, and math. But of course, over time, the Gupta Empire weakens, and attacks from the Huns eventually break the empire. So what is this Buddhism thing anyway? Well, it's kind of Hinduism light, but minus the gods. Buddhists believe in monoism, or the idea that everything came from one source, and hold that there are four noble truths, most of which are sad truths, and they want to reach in nirvana, or enlightenment, and so you need to follow the Eightfold Path. And if you reach nirvana, you don't have to be reborn again. Also, there's karma. Now, in Southeast Asia, Theravada Buddhism takes root, which is more strict, but in China and Northern Asia, Mahayana Buddhism takes root, which is less strict. So now to China. Whew, this is getting a bit long, but stay with me here. China starts off in the Huanghe River, up here, where they grow millet, but the Yangtze River, which is down here, also has civilization, and they grow rice down there. So eventually, rice becomes the dominant crop. So the first two major dynasties are the Shang and Zhou. The Zhou dynasty uses feudalism to run its empire, and feudalism leads to a lot of feuds. Who knew? And this gets out of hand and enters China into the War in States period until this guy named Qin Shi Huangdi will unite China under his dynasty, the Qin dynasty, and enforce legalism, which was a philosophy encouraging harsh government rule. This dynasty is going to build the Great Wall and terracotta warriors. Now, after the Qin dynasty falls, the Han dynasty arises, and this society uses Confucianism and also uses the Silk Road to trade. With all this government change, the mandate of heaven is invoked, which claims that dynasties must fall, and that it's the will of the ancestors that a new dynasty arise. But China just doesn't give us history, it also gives us philosophy. Now, Taoism was founded by Lao Tzu and emphasized finding one's Tao, or their way. Taoism encouraged simple and humble life that was with nature. Confucianism was also founded by this guy named Confucius and encouraged the importance of relationships and education. Children had to care for their parents and respect them, and this concept was called filial piety. Confucian thought also helped create the civil service exam that was used to help hire people in China's massive bureaucracy. Now, most of this Chinese culture is going to heavily influence both Japan and Korea. Japan will adopt the rice farming from Chinese and eventually adopt Mahayana Buddhism from China into what they will call Zen Buddhism. Now, this Zen Buddhism is going to be able to coexist with Shintoism, which is the state religion of Japan, and they have these cool monuments called kami. Japan will also have a feudal system where the emperor holds very little power, and all the real political power comes from the shogun, a military dictator. Okay, now we have to go through Mongols, Africa, America's trade and exploration, and then we're done. Mongols are led by Genghis Khan, and they basically conquer everywhere that's not Europe, Africa, Americas, or Southeast Asia. In West Africa, there's an emphasis on trade and tribes. Ghana starts a legacy of empires in West Africa, which is followed up by Mali, with the famous Mansa Musa, who was so rich that he just gave out bags of gold to people. Mali becomes extremely rich off of the salt and gold trade, and trade centers like Timbuktu become urban centers and huge places of learning. But Mali collapses and the Songhai takes over and basically starts the slave trade. Yikes. In East Africa, there's the Christian kingdom of Axum and then the trading states of the Swahili and Great Zimbabwe, which were known for huge stone forts. In the Americas, the Olmecs start civilization, but the Mayans soon dominate the Yucatan Peninsula with their city-states and huge pyramids. They are polytheists and even use human sacrifice and have an advanced irrigation system. They're going to use hieroglyphics and develop the 365-day calendar, number systems with 0, and astronomical advances. However, they go away for a variety of reasons, and the Aztecs dominate as a military society with the capital city of Tenochtitlan. The Aztecs will have a system of farming where they use artificial farmland, and they're going to basically build an empire. But they're going to be conquered by another empire, Spain and the conquistador Hernando Cortez. Now, the Incas are the last civilization of Mesoamerica, which was another empire radiating from the capital of Machu Picchu, who built roads, bridges, and used a rope, string, and knot system to keep records. The Incas had many medical advances, including brain surgery. However, like the Aztecs, they're going to be conquered by the Spanish. Okay, trade. Silk roads between China and the Mediterranean, which brought silk, porcelain, gunpowder, and paper. Trans-Saharan between the Mediterranean and West Africa, which brought salt and gold. Maritime trade between Southeast Asia, India, Arabia, and East Africa, which brought spices. And the Hanseatic League in Northern Europe helped Northern European states facilitate trade through rivers. And finally, exploration. Europeans no longer can trade east because of Constantinople being conquered by the Turks in 1453, so they have to find another way to trade. Motivated by God, gold, and glory, they sail west towards the Americas. Portugal leads the way with navigation and exploration motivated by the efforts of Prince Henry the Navigator. Spain will find the New World by Christopher Columbus and establish a huge kingdom there, and the English will discover Canada under the explorer John Cabot. That's World History 1. I'm Colin Fogarty, and I'm out.